The one thing everybody seems to agree on about the property market is that there is a problem with supply. According to recent studies, the Dublin area needs an average of around 7,500 new units a year, but last year less than 1,500 were built. But there's much less agreement on the reason for that lack of supply. Is it lack of money, the high cost of land, or something else? Primetime asked Ronan Lyons, Assistant Professor of Economics at Trinity College, to give his personal take on why we aren't building enough homes.
Looking back over the history of the Irish housing market, from the boom of the mid-70s to the recession of the late 80s, a simple rule emerges. When prices rise, so does construction. So it was no surprise that home building collapsed once the bubble burst in 2007.
What's more puzzling is what's happened since then. In the space of just 2 years, rents and prices in Dublin have increased by a third, and yet commencements and completions in Dublin remain stubbornly low. In a city growing by 10,000 families a year, fewer than 1,400 homes were built in 2013. So the real question is this: with rents and prices rising rapidly in Dublin since 2012, why aren't we seeing another building boom? Where are all the cranes?
In 1995, the average price of a home was €115,000. If you exclude the builder's profit, the cost of land, labour, materials and regulation was roughly €100,000. During the boom, the price of the typical home ballooned to over €350,000. So costs could double and no one would worry because revenues were plentiful. However, once the value of the typical home fell from over €350,000 to just €175,000, the cost base mattered again. If, even before the developer looks at margins, it's unlikely they will make their other costs back, then perhaps the mystery of the missing cranes is no mystery at all. But what if there's simply no capital? Between bust banks and broke builders, maybe the problem is simply that there are no developers left. The Grange in South Dublin is a development that stalled during the crash and was only completed with the intervention of NAMA. David Cantwell worked with developers on the project.
There are very few schemes of this scale taking place. There's probably 3 or 4 large apartment blocks have been built in the Greater Dublin area in the last year. They've all been built for rental. There's nobody been able yet to produce something for the for sale market. Just the overall costs are just too high.
While investors are not building new homes, they are investing in stock built during the boom.
There's been several billion euros invested in Irish property, both commercial and residential, by overseas investors. It's interesting that an awful lot of the property they probably actually bought below the cost of reproduction, i.e. you actually can't build units for the prices that they have paid. Will they actually now come forward and build? At the moment it's very tight.
Dublin's regulations also mean that smaller studio apartments are not allowed.
There wasn't a huge part of the market, and it never will be a huge part, but there is a place for that, for key workers in city centre areas. They need accommodation, it's affordable.
So if anything, the last few years have seen unprecedented interest in Irish property from investors overseas. In a healthy market, investors who couldn't get what they wanted through buying would simply get it instead through building. But this isn't happening. The number of units commenced in Dublin in 2013 was less than 1,400. Why? It seems the answer lies in regulation. In an Ireland that's had to deal with the legacy of excessive construction, much of it very poorly built, few are going to argue against extra regulation. But we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that lots of regulations is a substitute for good regulation. In 2007, the Department of the Environment introduced new building regulations for Ireland. Dublin City Council's development plan, however, has even higher requirements. For example, the minimum size of apartments in Dublin is roughly 30% above the national standards. Also, all units should have dual orientation, and in no circumstances will a north-facing unit be allowed.
In many cities, with a site like this, you'd be required to have 1 basement car parking space for every 4 units, provided the site is central or close to public transport. In Dublin, however, you're required to have 4 times as many car parking spaces, adding about €15,000 to the cost of every unit. Taking all this into account with the minimum size requirements and the restrictions in orientation, this adds about €50,000 to the cost of building a 2-bed apartment. And anything that adds to cost adds to price.
While many of these specifications are nice to have, are they making new apartments unaffordable to all but the very rich? All costs affect rents. A rule of thumb is that every €1,000 in costs converts into €6 in monthly rent. So a two-bedroom apartment in central Dublin, barely meeting minimum standards, would need to rent for more than €2,700 a month just to break even. To pay that, a tenant would need to be earning €140,000 a year. Is it any wonder that little has been built in Dublin in the last few years? Only the wealthiest can afford new Dublin City Council standard apartments. Rents currently for two beds in Dublin range from €1,150 in Dublin 9 to €1,650 in Dublin 4. Unsurprisingly, rental costs have a direct impact on Dublin's competitiveness as a hub for foreign direct investment.
The increase in house prices is good for some people, and indeed may be good for the economy in so far as it loosens up the property market as people move out of negative equity. But if it continues and if it gets out of control, it can actually damage competitiveness, because high prices for housing, house purchase or for rent drive up the costs to the consumers. That in turn puts pressure on pay demands. That affects the costs of exporting industries, so that's bad for competitiveness.
Multinational companies have to take rent costs into consideration because they increase salary costs.
But I am hearing complaints about accommodation being increasingly difficult to find. One of the members of the NCC, who's the MD of a very big IT-based company, told us that 40 people in that company turned up to look at a single house on one Saturday morning. Now, that's pushing it. We've got to do something about supply.
But over-regulation is not only happening in our capital. Those involved in construction are increasingly worried that Dublin disease has spread throughout the country through the Building Control Amendment regulations which came into force earlier in the year. Largely a response to Priory Hall, these extra regulations seem to miss the point completely that the mistake in Priory Hall was not a lack of regulation, it was a failure to enforce the regulation that was there.
And we've all got to avoid what happened in Priory Hall. I just think what has been brought in these new regulations seems to be expensive to deliver, and it may not be delivering enough consumer protection. So in that instance, I think it's overly expensive and therefore is a hindrance to delivering more housing stock for the city that the city so badly needs.
These new rules require an assigned certifier, usually an architect, to be responsible for inspecting a build throughout construction and signing off that it has complied with building regulations.
I think it is possible that the new regulations in Ireland could result in shoddy builders taking more liabilities and attempting to push that responsibility onto an assigned certifier. The problem, of course, with that is that the homeowner is left to sue the assigned certifier, and chasing an individual professional through a clogged up court system is difficult, timely and expensive.
We should be even more concerned about the impact these regulations are having on the poorest in society, because ultimately housing is a human right. With increasing rents, more and more people are becoming homeless. Focus Ireland tries to find accommodation for people who've lost their homes.
We're working a family who have become homeless because their landlord was repossessed, and they're now living in a hotel or whatever, but one of them might be working. Now, in the sort of way we would have run the housing market in Ireland a few years ago, they would be in social housing. So we haven't built social housing over the last number of years, so they were in the private rented sector. And now they've been squeezed out of the private rented sector by other families who are on higher incomes, who in other circumstances would be buying their own home. Those are hard-working families or recently unemployed families who just don't have enough money to be able to afford the private rent.
The government's housing regulations introduced last year on minimum sizes and facilities in rented accommodation effectively banned cheaper bedsit accommodation and has worsened Dublin's homelessness problem.
You can't have landlords renting out broom cupboards or spare rooms for people who are vulnerable. But we can get into a situation where people who have lots of choices about where they might live decide for other people what's acceptable for them. And we need to accept it, recognise that people are vulnerable, but we need to also listen to what they want rather than just assume what's good for them.
Is it any wonder there are increasing numbers of homeless people in Dublin? A family earning €45,000 a year can sustainably pay no more than €1,000 a month on housing costs. This means it should cost no more than €145,000 to build a home for that family before VAT. In central Dublin currently, even a two-bed apartment for that family would cost €400,000. This is not about forcing people to live in shoeboxes. This is about preventing people from living in perfectly adequate homes that would be encouraged if they lived anywhere else in Europe. It's a basic equation in society that the cost of building a home should be in some way related to people's incomes. Currently, it seems that is far from the case. But we can't take my word for it. It is imperative that an audit takes place on the cost of building the homes we need. This would enable everyone, in particular policymakers, to identify what adds to the cost, what is necessary, and what can be done away with without sacrificing standards.
Society needs regulation about safety, but regulation that's about preferences, like minimum apartment size or orientation, we need to be a lot more careful about. What if Dublin City Council decided that from now on anyone buying a new car had to buy a Merc to improve the tone of the city's streets? There'd be an outrage at discrimination against those on lower incomes. So why is it so different when it's about our homes?
Now, Dublin City Council issued a statement to prime time in response to Ronan Lyons' report there. And they said the following: in Dublin City there is planning permission for over 2,000 housing units. The current standards in Dublin City were introduced in 2007 in response to widespread criticism by both political representatives and the public of the previous standards, which had failed to provide a good quality living environment for residents. The council says the main factors contributing to lack of housing output are the lack of development capital, relatively high land and site value, reduced capacity of the building sector, outstanding debts of many developers, and difficulties in obtaining finance by both house builders and house purchasers. Well, I'm joined here in studio by economist Ronan Lyons to discuss some of the views he expressed in that report, and by Mary Hughes, who's president of the Irish Planning Institute. Mary, if I could come to you first, would you accept that regulations perhaps have something to do with the lack of supply in Dublin and around the country?
I think we have to look at what we want to achieve here. Ultimately, we need quality development. We cannot afford to go back to the standard of apartments that were produced under the urban renewal schemes and the regeneration schemes in the 80s and 90s.
I agree.
We cannot afford to go back there, and therefore we do need quality development, and as a result we do need a certain amount of regulation in terms of apartment standards and apartment qualities. In Ireland, I mean, we are recognised as having one of the lower apartment standards in Europe, and we are well behind Germany and France and Denmark in that regard. And indeed, a recent BBC report, well, recent enough, in 2009, actually confirmed that the house size in Ireland was second behind the UK in Europe.
But what about the argument that it's about affordability at the end of the day? And if somebody wants to trade off having a north-facing apartment, which obviously has huge disadvantages, but they want to trade that off for paying a lower price, shouldn't they have the right to make that choice?
And they do have the right to make that choice. Presently in Dublin, in certain parts of Dublin, particularly in the north inner city, there are 46% of the apartments in the north inner city comprise of one bed or less size apartments. So the choice is there. The purpose of these standards is to ensure that we have sufficient quality apartments to ensure that we can attract families into the city of Dublin and to ensure that we have a livable city. OK,
Ronan, you probably won't be astounded to learn that on social media already everybody's giving out about the idea of shoebox apartments. So you mentioned it in the report. But as Mary says, we've seen, I'm sure we've all been in them, in the North Inner City in particular, the stuff that was put up in the 80s and the 90s. They're horrible.
Yeah, well, I mean, I live on the North Circular Road. I see the previous generation. I see the pre-63 bed sits. No one is talking about building pre-63 bed sits. No one is talking about building 80s or 90s standard apartments. The only reason those got built was because of tax incentives. What I want Ireland to move away from is a system built on temporary tax incentives, cutting VAT, lower levies. That's not the system we need. We need a system that produces, in the long run, the kind of units we want to live in. Now, the mistake here is at thinking that size and quality are the same thing. Most cities in Europe will allow you to build a 30 square metre or a 40 square metre unit if it is good quality. Unfortunately, in Dublin now, you cannot build even a 45 square metre unit. It has to be 55 square metre if it's one bed and 85 square metre if it's two bed. They are very high compared to other European cities.
But Ronan, how can you say it's not related to quality when you talk about potentially providing apartments on north-facing aspects? I mean, that's not quality development. That is not taking into account the regulations in terms of building quality, the regulations in terms of CO2 emissions and higher heating standards.
If we cared about CO2 emissions, we would actually have lower parking space requirements.
I do agree.
Not higher parking space requirements. This is not about sustainability. This is about somebody deciding that north-facing apartments aren't nice to live in, and therefore, if you buy a site in Dunleary right now, you cannot have units that look solely out at the rising sun. It is bonkers that planners have decided none of us can live in a new apartment that is north or east facing.
But that is the whole issue. I mean, the planning system is there to achieve balance within the housing market, and it's there to meet the diverse needs of all different range of people in society. The important thing is that we produce and provide a housing supply which is diverse, which meets and satisfies a number of different needs and requirements.
But isn't that what Ronan is saying?
But effectively,
exactly
yes, but what we are saying is that in Dublin City in particular, there is perhaps an imbalance at the minute. The imbalance is in relation to effectively the shoebox apartments which are there at the minute. We need to counteract that imbalance, and the only way that we can do that is providing for better quality apartments which are, I suppose, appealing to a wider society.
Ronan, we saw in the statement from Dublin City Council that there are lots of possible reasons for the lack of building, and I mean, one of them is if somebody bought land at the height of the boom, the prices still are a long way off from where it would be profitable for them to build on it. So, you know, that's as much a reason as regulation, surely.
I think we need to move away from the Celtic Tiger model of how Irish houses get built or how Irish dwellings get built, which is that Irish banks fund Irish developers who hire Irish builders. We have had so much international interest in the Irish housing market over the last 5 years, and almost none of those have decided that the numbers stack up. The weight of evidence is that you cannot build based on where prices and rents are. And the scary thing is prices and rents are very high relative to people's incomes. So we need to completely tackle our cost base in building, whether it's an apartment, whether it's a suburban home, or whether it's a rural one-off. We need to find out what's the cost and how can we reduce the cost without sacrificing the very real standards that we do need for minimum accommodation. But we are mixing up value creating regulation, the kind of stuff that makes sure nobody has substandard accommodation, stuff we wouldn't want anyone to live in, with sort of what I would call value destroying regulation. By stopping people from building north-facing units, you're also stopping people from building south-facing units, because they look at a site and they say, if I can't use half the site for the kind of unit I want to build, the whole site is worthless to me.
And that's where dual aspect units come into play. But effectively, I mean, planning is there to ensure and to regulate the market to a certain extent, to ensure that we have a diverse housing supply. Without the apartment standards, that will not be achieved. I mean, planning is not perfect. I suppose the message from an awful lot of this is that we do need, I suppose, further study in the area. We do need certainly greater data and statistics in the area, but that effectively, I mean, planning can't be the sole issue that's looked at.
OK, Mary and Ronan, thank you both. We have run out of time, but thank you both for joining.